Hey everybody, and welcome to the next chapter, selecting subsets of data from DataFrames with Lok. So the objectives here are: Lok can select rows, columns, or rows and columns simultaneously, and Lok selects primarily by label. All right, so let's go ahead and learn a little bit about this Lok Indexer. So Lok will help make you selections in a completely different manner than just the brackets, which we just learned. So just the brackets selects columns or selects data in one way. Lok selects data in a completely different way. So it has its own set of rules. So you have to learn those set of rules and only apply those rules whenever it's selecting data. Okay, number one is that a .lok selection, df.lok, will look something like this, where you can simultaneously select rows and columns. Okay, so that is one thing that Lok allows you to do. Allows you to select simultaneously rows and columns. Just the brackets does not allow you to simultaneously select rows and columns. And the major thing, the most important thing about Lok is that it selects by label. Okay? There's one actual case where you can use Boolean selection, but that will come up later. But it primarily selects by label. And that's why the word label is in caps. That's very, very important. Lok selects by label. All right. So let's see some examples here. Let's read in our data frame. This sample data frame, just so we can have something to play with. All right, so in this example, I'm going to select 2 rows and 3 columns with Lok. So let's select some rows. We can just select like Nico and Dean. Those will be 2 rows. And then we'll select some columns here. We'll just select state and score and color. So I really like separating this out into 2 lines. We have rows and calls here, and so we have 2 lists, and we're just going to simply place those lists in the selection or in the brackets over here, appended to Lok. So Lok allows you to do simultaneous row and column selection. The row selection will be separated from the column selection by a comma. So that's important. So it's rows, comma, columns. It's always like that. So rows, comma, columns. So here we're using a list for the rows and also a list for the columns. Let's go ahead and execute this. So we selected the Nico and Dean rows and the state, score, and color columns. Okay, so that's our first example of simultaneous selection with Lok. And notice we have to use the labels here, so you have to pass in exactly what the index says and exactly what the columns say above here. All right, let's see a few more examples. Okay, so before we get there, let's talk about the different types of selections within Lok. So by this, I mean the rows or columns can be either a single label, a list of labels, a slice of labels, or a Boolean series or array. So we just saw an example where both row and column selection was a list of labels. But you can also use just a single label, or you can use a slice of labels. And we're going to see examples of all of those coming up. All right, so here's an example we're going to do next, where we're going to select 2 rows and a single column. So let's actually print out our data first, so we have this here. So we'll say rows again will be, we could just do the same one, Nico and Dean. And then calls, we can say we'll select a single column. So we'll just use a single label, a string. So this is a valid selection with Lok. So we do rows, comma, calls again. And this time we get Nico and Dean. So this is a little bizarre, the output, right? So here's Nico and Dean. But we've only selected one column, the age column, so it's just going to return a series. So it's going to return this series, just Nico and Dean, just these 2 values, 2 and 32. So we have a 2-value series with the index equal to Nico and Dean. So if you do select one column or one row, then you'll actually just get back a series. Okay, so this example shows how you can use a single label, so just a string. All right, so let's see how we can use slice notation. Okay, so with slice notation, it works just like you would select in a list, but you have to use labels. So let's select from Nico all the way to Dean. So that's the row selection. So I'm slicing here, Nico to Dean. And we'll use slice notation to actually, if you just put just a colon like this, it will actually slice everything, which means it'll just select all of the columns. So this is actually valid slice notation. So again, slice notation, if you're not familiar with slice notation, it has three components. It has start, stop, and step. They are all separated by a colon. They are actually all optional components. So this particular slice notation over here has a start and a stop value. It does not have a step value. So if the step value is not given, then it will just step through by 1. So we're going to go from Nico to Dean and go by 1, which just means we're going to grab every single value here, Nico to Dean. So this is the row selection. So it's rows, comma, calls. And then we have the column selection, which is sort of this bizarre colon, but this just simply stands for all of the columns. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So it's selected Nico to Dean, and it has selected all of the columns. So slice notation is fine. Now, slice notation only works inside of these brackets when it's appended to, a data frame. You cannot have slice notation outside of these brackets. It just is syntactically wrong. So if I try to do this, if I try to assign slice notation to rows, you're going to get a syntax error. So that does not work. So you can use the slice function, but that's not really in the scope here, and it's just not actually good pandas. All right, so what you will see though, pandas makes the column selection optional. So if you don't put the column selection, it will assume the very first selection you put in here is rows. It will always use the very first selection as rows. So these two are identical. Now, you might say, like, why even show you this one up here? Why not just go directly here? So in fact, I really like the first one better because it's explicit and it's clear, because now you reinforce the fact that Lok does simultaneous selection of rows and columns. So it's always rows, comma, columns. This, without the comma there and the colon, it might confuse some people when you take that shortcut. So this is very clear that you have rows, comma, calls. So I do like this. Of course, if you feel comfortable, you can use this as well. So there's no harm with that. Now, you can also slice the columns too. You're not just limited to just the rows. So let's go ahead and see an example of that. So say we want Nico to Dean, but we also want to select, color. Let's just say we want to go all the way to the end. So if we just put a colon and don't have an end to our slice, it will just go all the way to the end. And this is a good time to mention that so slice notation with Lok is inclusive of the very last label. So when you're doing slice notation with a list using integers, it is exclusive. That means it does not include the very last one. So pandas is inclusive when you're using Lok. So it will select that very last label if it exists in your data frame. So it doesn't stop before Dean, it stops at Dean and selects Dean. All right, so this will go from color all the way to the end. You can say go to the end, but hop by 2. So get every other column starting at color. So color, age, score. So this is the step. The stop here is just nothing, which just means go all the way to the end. So you are, you are perfectly capable of using slice notation for the columns as well. Now, if you want to get all of the rows, well, you can simply do that by doing slice notation, or just using just the single colon, which will slice all of the rows. Okay, so that's an example of slice notation. That's what I just did right here. So let's move on. And I shortened it. Okay, so you can select one single cell in your data frame. So let's go ahead and print out our data so we have a look at this. So you can use a single label for both the row and column selection. So say we want Aaron and food. Well, Aaron is the row selection, food is the column selection. It is a single label. So Aaron and food and pandas at this point, I didn't use .lok, so this is a common thing I forget, is actually to use the correct indexer. So I'm glad I made that mistake so you could see it. So it selects mango, it just selects whatever's in that particular cell of the data frame. Now notice you're not in pandas anymore. You don't have a series, you don't have a data frame, you have a Python string. So you're completely outside of pandas at this point. All right. I want to show you something else. This might be a little bit confusing. So again, I'll just show you the data. So you can, and I forgot Lok again, you can select a single row just in its entirety. And this is a little bit confusing. So if I just select Dean, and I can do it like this just so you can see all of the row and column, the full thing, rows, comma, columns. So you'll see that it'll select all the columns, but it's confusing because it sort of transposes as output from a horizontal output to vertical series. So the data is the same, but the visual output is a little bit different. So this can be confusing for some people. So this is one reason why pandas is a little confusing when doing subset selection, is that you can sort of get something transposed that you weren't expecting. So if you're selecting a single row, you'll get a column. It'll appear vertically on your screen. Now you don't need that that column selection by default. Pandas will go ahead and just assume you want to select all of the columns there. So this just gets the row. So you can shorten it like this. But again, I really like to keep the colon there just because, at least in the beginning, it reinforces the fact that Lok is rows and columns together. Okay, so here's a summary of Lok. So it's primarily label based, and here we only use labels. So that's the key thing. You have to use the labels for the rows or the columns. It can select rows and columns simultaneously. So you cannot use just the brackets to do row and column selection simultaneously. Lok does allow this. So you give it rows, comma, calls. And then what can the selections be? So the row or column selections can be either a single label, a list of labels, a slice of labels, or a Boolean series. And we will see this coming up. So we didn't cover this part. And the other thing is you have to put a comma between the row and column selections. All right, so that wraps it up for this part of Lok, and we're going to see iLok coming up next. Now, if you want to learn more, please consider buying the book, Master Data Analysis with Python, Volume 1, Foundations of Data Exploration. There are 600 pages, 300 exercises, multiple projects, and detailed solutions. All right, see you guys in the next section.